Yes, I'm going to continue on in this unit. So, as I explained previously, this unit's kind of a mix of um, cell reproduction, and we just talked about meiosis, a little bit about reproduction, focusing on human reproduction, and then we're going to move into genetics from there. So today we're going to talk a little bit about human reproduction. We will start by talking about the male reproductive system, female reproductive system, reproductive cycles, eventually fertilization, development, and birth. So we'll start today with the human male reproductive system. And so when we talk about reproduction in animals, one of the things we talk about is what type of fertilization development a group of organisms has. So humans are mammals. Mammals have what we call internal fertilization. The sperm fertilizes the egg cell inside of the female body. And then, for the most part, excuse me, mammals have internal development as well. That after fertilization, the offspring develops internally in the female's body until birth. So the structures and organs and systems that mammals and humans have allow for that process to take place, allow for the sperm cell to fertilize the egg cell, and then allow for the development of that offspring. So the male reproductive system is adapted to basically delivering sperm cells into the female reproductive tract. Okay? And so it begins with the testes. So the testes, also testicles, they mean the same thing. Testes are the organ that is responsible for production of sperm cells, as well as the male sex hormone testosterone. So the testes are held in a pouch of skin called the scrotum. Okay? That is sort of external to the body. And the reason for that is because the optimum temperature for sperm production and maturing is slightly cooler than body temperature. So the male testes are held outside of the body in the scrotum. That keeps them a couple degrees cooler than normal body temperature, and that allows for optimum sperm production and maturation. The testes start inside the abdominal cavity of the fetus, and then around birth they descend into the scrotum. So as we just learned when we were talking about meiosis is the type of cell division that takes cells that are diploid, that have two copies of chromosomes, and produces cells that are haploid, okay, cells that have half the number of chromosomes. If we're talking about humans, haploid cells have 23 chromosomes. Sperm cells are haploid cells. They're gametes. They are the male sex cell. And so the structure within the testes that produces these cells are called the seminiferous tubules. These are the structures in which meiosis takes place, producing these sperm cells. However, the sperm cells produced in these seminiferous tubules, they're haploid cells, but they are not fully mature. They're not motile. They cannot actually move at this point. From the seminiferous tubules, those immature sperm cells go into a structure called the epididymis, which is sort of on the outside of the testes. I'll show you an illustration in a minute. And that's where these sperm cells are stored and eventually mature over time, so that they're motile and can swim before they're released during ejaculation. So the sperm cells themselves are specialized cells. As we said, they're gametes, they're haploid cells. They're very small. Okay? They're about 90,000 times smaller than an egg cell. And when they leave the epididymis during ejaculation, they travel through a tube called the vas deferens. And I'm going to move on this slide just to show you sort of these structures. So here we have the testy, one testy. Okay. Here we have the seminiferous tubules, which are where meiosis happens. Okay, those immature sperm cells move into the epididymis, this structure here. This is a very elongated, it's called convoluted tube. Okay, and eventually those sperm, when they are released, travel out. This connects up here to this tube called the vas deferens. So here, okay, are the testicle, okay, the epididymis. Then sperm travel through this tube called the vas deferens. Vas deferens comes up into the abdominal cavity, loops around the bladder, okay, and then goes through the several glands, and then it merges with the urethra. Okay, and the urethra is going to be the tube that carries those sperm cells and other parts of the semen out of the male body through the penis. Go back here to our last slide. I can't. There we go. So those sperm cells make their way through the vas deferens, and during one ejaculation, a male can release tens or hundreds of millions of individual sperm cells. They can survive for 24 to 48 hours as they are trying to make their way to the egg cell to fertilize it. But as those sperm cells are traveling through the vas deferens, they go through that tube, and as they are moving along, several different glands add to the sperm cells to produce semen. Okay, so some of those glands are the prostate gland, the Cowper's gland, the seminal vesicle, and these glands produce different fluids to nourish and to house those sperm cells. Okay, the prostate gland produces alkaline fluid with a high pH that helps protect the sperm from the more acidic fluids of the vagina. The Cowper's gland provides fluid for moisture. The seminal vesicle secretes nutrients the sperm are going to need as they attempt to make their journey to the egg cell. So all of these mixture of sperm cells along with these fluids is what's called semen. And during sexual intercourse, semen is ejaculated through the penis, deposited into the female reproductive tract, into the vagina, where those sperm cells start to make their journey to the egg cell. Just a couple notes here. You may have heard of a surgery called a vasectomy. Okay? A vasectomy is a type of surgery a man can have if they want to no longer be capable of having children. It's sort of a permanent method of birth control. And in a vasectomy, a doctor makes an incision in the scrotum, takes the vas deferens tube, cuts it, seals off the ends, and now, therefore, the man that had the vasectomy, these sperm cells produced by the testes can no longer get out of the man's body. Obviously, therefore, he cannot make a woman pregnant. Okay? Man still produces the other parts of the semen, but that semen doesn't have sperm cells in it. So that's a vasectomy. And there's an equivalent type of surgery we'll talk about in females. So the male deposits sperm cells into the female vagina, and then they make their way to the egg cell. So if we look at the female reproductive system is adapted to also produce gametes, egg cells, and allow them to be fertilized, but also then to support a developing embryo and fetus after fertilization has taken place. So the ovaries are the organ in females that produce the egg cells. So meiosis is a process that happens in the ovaries. Egg cells are the female reproductive cell. Also, several hormones are produced in the ovaries. These are reproductive hormones that are important in regulating the reproductive cycle. The ovaries are in the lower abdomen. They're about an inch in diameter, sort of oval-shaped organs. And actually they contain immature eggs at birth. So really, human women, females, do not produce new egg cells throughout their lifetime. They're basically born with all of the egg cells that they will have for their entire life. Once a woman reaches puberty, then those eggs begin maturing. Okay? And there's a well-regulated process that relies on several hormones we'll be talking about that allows for the development of those eggs, the maturing of them, and also the support of the embryo and the fetus. Those hormones also are responsible, just like in males, testosterone is the male sex hormone. It's responsible for the development of male secondary sex characteristics, things like a deeper voice, more body hair, changes to muscle composition, things like that. Females, that hormone is estrogen. That estrogen hormone that's released in the ovaries results in breast development, in less hair development, changes to the pelvis, things like that. So those egg cells, an egg cell is typically thought of as the largest cell, okay, in a human. A single egg cell is actually visible to the naked eye. It's very small, but they're about 1/10 of a millimeter. And the egg cell is the female gamete. And inside of the ovaries, they are within small sort of pockets that are called follicles. That's Finn, the mailman just came, so. And so these small pockets within the ovaries called follicles contain in them immature eggs. And once the menstrual cycle begins, once each reproductive cycle, one of these follicles starts to mature, the egg cell within it starts to mature, and then eventually is released. The process when that egg cell gets released from the ovary is called ovulation. Okay? Typically, one egg cell is ovulated each reproductive cycle, each month or so. Sometimes more than one can be released, sometimes one's not released. So the ovary releases this egg cell, which then travels through a tube called the fallopian tube or the oviduct. They both mean the same thing. And so this egg, as it's traveling through this oviduct, it's on its way to the uterus, which is a muscular sac that will eventually house the embryo and fetus as it's growing and developing. The opening of that uterus is called the cervix, okay, which leads to the vagina, and the vagina is the muscular tube that receives sperm during reproduction, also the passageway for the fetus to be born during delivery. And so during intercourse, tens or hundreds of millions of sperm, along with their semen, are released into the female vagina, and then they start making their way toward the egg cell that's been released. The egg cell releases chemicals that sort of the sperm cells can locate, and they make their way to the egg, and out of those hundreds of millions, only a few dozen will likely reach the egg in the fallopian tube and fertilize it. One single sperm cell can fertilize the egg cell, but a few dozen get to the egg cell, but only one can actually fertilize it. If we look at some diagrams here, this is the female reproductive system. So we have here ovaries on each side, a left and a right ovary. This is the oviduct or fallopian tube, where that egg cell that's released from this ovary travels, makes its way into the uterus, which is this hollow organ, the opening of which is the cervix, and then the passageway out of the body is the vagina. The surgery a woman could have that I was mentioning earlier, that's equivalent to sort of a vasectomy, is called a tubal ligation. And basically, a doctor would do a surgery where they cut the fallopian tubes or the oviduct and seal them off. And that it works in a way that's similar to the male vasectomy, is that the egg cells, as they're released each reproductive cycle, they cannot get into the uterus. Also, sperm cells cannot reach the egg because that fallopian tube has been cut, and therefore the woman can't be pregnant. So the cycle in which women release an egg cell and allow for fertilization, it's called the menstrual cycle. And we'll talk a little bit about it. And the menstrual cycle begins during puberty and lasts for 28 to 32 days on average. It depends on from woman to woman. And begins at puberty and ends at a time called menopause. And menopause is when a woman's reproductive cycle basically stops. It can vary in woman to woman. It varies according to age and stress levels and many different factors. And so we'll talk about sort of the different stages of the menstrual cycle, reproductive cycle, and we'll talk a little bit about the hormones that control the reproductive cycle and sort of what happens in each stage. So the first stage is called the follicle stage. Now this is a cycle, so it can really begin anywhere because this cycle will repeat each month or so. The follicle stage will start there, and this lasts for maybe 10 to 14 days. And this is when a hormone called FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, is released from the pituitary gland up near the brain. And this hormone's effect is that it stimulates in the ovary one of these follicles, one of these little cavities with an immature egg in it to start to mature. Okay. So as that follicle starts to mature, it releases its own hormones. It releases estrogen. And estrogen's effect is to cause the lining of the uterus to start to thicken, to develop a higher supply of blood vessels. And what it's doing is it's getting the uterus ready for a fertilized egg to implant. After the follicle stage comes the ovulation stage. This is when the follicle has been fully matured, the egg within it has matured, and so eventually when it's fully matured, that egg cell is released. The follicle breaks open at the surface of the ovary and releases the egg cell into the fallopian tube. After this stage, another hormone starts to become important called LH, luteinizing hormone. Okay? So the luteinizing hormone is also secreted by the pituitary gland, and as this ovulation step is getting closer, the combination of these three hormones, the level of these three hormones, estrogen, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone, the coordination of those hormones allows for the follicle to release that egg cell. After that egg cell is released, the follicle that remains turns into a structure that's called the corpus luteum. Okay, and this is called the corpus luteum stage. And as the LH levels increase in the blood, the follicle produces this corpus luteum, and it begins producing another hormone called progesterone. And this hormone, progesterone, is a hormone that prevents any new follicles from forming. It also helps maintain the lining of the uterus. Finally, if an egg cell is not fertilized and does not implant, we reach the menstruation stage, about the 28th day or so. So again, this is only if a fertilized egg cell is not present. And what happens in the menstruation stage is progesterone that's being produced inhibits the LH, and that lining of the uterus is no longer being maintained and it is eventually shed, breaks down, pulls away from the walls of the uterus, and leaves the woman's body during the menstrual period. So when a woman gets the menstrual period, that's the shedding of the lining of the uterus. And then the process would repeat again with a follicle stage, and a new follicle would start to mature, eventually ovulating, release an egg into the corpus luteum stage. If there's no fertilization, if there's no embryo, menstruation happens. This process repeats month after a woman reaches reproductive age, and it stops when either she reaches menopause or when she becomes pregnant, and we'll be talking about that. So if we look at some of these hormones, this is an important illustration here, and it shows the different phases of the menstrual cycle, of the reproductive cycle. There's a couple changes that happen. One is change in body temperature. A woman's body temperature does fluctuate with her reproductive cycle. Okay? That during the ovulation stage, there's an increase in body temperature, which stays elevated for the luteal phase. And so some women actually use this to try to time when they're ovulating. Some women can take their temperature daily and start to know exactly when they're ovulating by that change in body temperature. This next graph shows the level of those 4 hormones associated with the reproductive cycle. And we see FSH in blue, LH in pink, estrogen in gray, and progesterone in purple. Okay, and again you see that they peak. Progesterone peaks later in the cycle. FSH and LH and estrogen all sort of peak at the same time, which is the trigger for the release of the egg cell for ovulation. And then progesterone, which maintains the uterine lining, peaks afterwards. And here in the bottom we see the lining of the uterus and how it changes throughout that cycle. Basically, you have the lining develops through the reproductive cycle and then eventually is shed during the menstrual period. Here we just have sort of a diagram that shows those hormones and where they're being produced. It's not really important you know all the details, but what you should know is that this is a complex system of feedback where some hormones inhibit other hormones and reduce them, others increase the production. There's positive feedback. So all these hormones are interacting to carefully regulate the reproductive cycle. And again, this is another a little bit more a little simpler illustration of some of that, where you have the pituitary gland producing FSH and LH, causing the follicle to begin growing. But as the follicle grows, okay, it also releases estrogen, okay, which inhibits the production of those hormones. And so you have this complex system of feedback. But as the follicle matures, okay, ovulation takes place, okay, and then the corpus luteum has feedbacks as well. So all these hormones are sort of working together. And you're going to be doing a lab in which you look at the levels of these different hormones and what's going on in the reproductive system of the woman as these hormones change. And this is, again, another version of this. This is sort of spelled out in words exactly what's going on through the reproductive cycle. And over here we see the different stages and the different feedback loops that are taking place. All right, so that's what we're going to stop with today. We're going to talk more about fertilization and development as we move on in this unit. But for now, we're going to stop with finish with the female reproductive cycle discussion. So I hope you guys have a good day, a good weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.